Okay, so today's presentation, glad everyone could join us. It's 7 steps to tracking the impact of your content campaigns. And I'd like everyone to just think for a quick minute. Think about some of the things you'd like to achieve in marketing, whether it's growing your team, adding on that new SaaS software that's going to add to your content campaigns, whether it's launching a new channel like content syndication or events. Think of all the things you'd love to do, and what is the one thing that really holds us back from being able to do those things? To me, that's predictability, right? Think of the sales team, for example, where the attribution of what they're producing and what they're doing connected to ROI is so clear that they're able to just say, if we add this many AEs, this is the revenue that we're going to produce. On the same end, what if we could do that on the marketing side and say, if these are the campaigns we're going to launch, here's what's going to come out the other end. If we put $1 here, $10 is going to come out here. And that's essentially what this presentation is going to go through today. Quick background on myself. I'm the director of demand generation at Handshake. Handshake is a B2B e-commerce platform and mobile sales app for manufacturers and distributors. Before that, I was director of demand gen, similar role at Think HR. And prior to that, for about 4 years, I was a very, very early member of a company called Lawline, which had very high growth, very rapid growth. I mentioned these 3 organizations because there were 3 rapid growth SaaS companies, of which we really, the content was extremely different across the board. One was law, one was HR, some similarities, and then the one now is manufacturing and distribution. Nonetheless, content was at the core of growing all 3 of those organizations, but the content was very, very different. But there were similarities underneath the surface that were about the data that we were capturing and about the process that we were nurturing leads through. And those are the tips, and those are the metrics that we're going to review today that we use in each one of those organizations. Yes. So you may not laugh or cry in this webinar, but you will get 3 things out of it. First off, what key metrics should we be tracking throughout the prospect lifecycle? Second, how can we better identify which assets are producing leads, pipeline, and revenue? And third, how can we use data to better predict which assets are going to lead to more revenue? So in kicking off, this may look familiar. Maybe we produce a specific asset. Say it's an ebook. For this instance, we'll just use an ebook. This is one we actually put out. It's ERP Integration Handbook. We put out an asset. Say we distribute it through social media, email, whatever the platforms we might want to be, or we might want to use. You take a look at how this actually progresses through the funnel. Sometimes we don't really know. We produce so many assets, and then we just kind of hope on the other end of it that stuff pops out, right? We get some money out of it, revenue pops out, and if we convince ourselves we produce great content, that at the other end, revenue is going to pop out. But that's not necessarily the case. In fact, I would argue the different in many situations where an adequate piece of content has a better chance of closing if you have a great process in place and you have a really clear viewpoint of how you get from point A to point B, which is that dollar. So this is not what we want to do. What we do want to do and how we want to view this presentation today is essentially looking at it in more of a funnel model, I suppose. So if we look at it from top to bottom, we have 3 terms: tofu, mofu, and bofu. Does anybody know what tofu means? What tofu referred to? Just yell it out. Top of funnel, yeah. So we have top of funnel, middle funnel, bottom of funnel. In top of funnel, we're going to have 2 metrics that we're going to look through today. One is visitors by page. 2 is name capture. In the middle of the funnel, we're going to take a look at MQL qualification rate, MQL by cohort, and opportunity analysis. And then finally, at the very bottom of the funnel, we're going to take a look at campaign attribution, campaign influence. And ultimately, these are the things that we want to, if we start with a piece of content at the top of that funnel, we want to narrow it down all the way to close one. And what are the steps that we need to do to get it from point A to point B? So let's start with tofu. Any vegans in the house? It looks delicious, I'm sure. So what if we said that you could basically do all this out of GA? I mean, for the most part, when we look at top of the funnel, and this is just top of the funnel, we're not quite in Salesforce yet. We can't really get that data out of there effectively. Similarly, we can't quite get that out of our automation systems to the fullest degree that we want. So ultimately, in all 3 organizations I've been in, I've used and leveraged Google Analytics for it. I'm going to go over some reports that I specifically used And if you'd like links to some of these things or ideas about how to create them, you can feel free. My info will be at the end of this as well. The first one is essentially visitors by page. And I think this is so important. And it seems like a very niche report to be looking at the total visitors by the actual pages that we're creating content by. But if you just look at total assets, or total visitors, I should say, so we're going to skip through this real quick. If you just looked at the total visitors that were coming to your website, you'd want to know a couple key things. First, you'd want to know what pages were contributing the most valuable leads or most valuable visitors to your site. For example, if you take a look at this here, you can see three key examples. One, we have three assets essentially that are at the top of our landing pages. One is best receipt tracking apps, two is this guerrilla marketing article, and three is this sales manager review article. And what's interesting about this is Handshake's analysis. These are our top three landing pages. None of these have anything to do with our actual product. So if we were just looking at total visitors and we were patting ourselves on the back for creating more visitors out of these, we would be doing ourselves an injustice, essentially. And so what you want to look at is not just total visitors. You want to be looking at this by page. And what you can use when you look at it by page and your total visitors by page is essentially what content can you produce next that will better funnel down those visitors from the points that they're visiting. For example, if I know somebody's coming to our website for something about receipt tracking apps, I know that has nothing to do with what we produce at Handshake, but I can look at that and I can know that they're interested in receipt tracking apps. I know our product has to do with sales order management apps. And I can make some sort of connection about best business apps, or I can make something that would connect the two dots there and produce a better lead out of that. Some examples of products that you can use, we use Opt-in Monster. I don't know if anybody's used this in the past, but essentially you can create unique pop-ups, things of that sort, sidebar ads, based off of the content that somebody's landing on. Similarly, I would advise using something called page value. I don't traditionally see this used, but you can set this up in the goals section of Google Analytics. And page value is essentially assigning a page value to each individual page. The more transactional your business is, the more you can actually make this into a dollar amount. However, I use something that's more like a lead score from 0 to 100. And how important is this page to me? So for example, if we have 10 pages, 8 pages, which is on here, if I'm getting a ton of page views at a very low quality, very low score page, that might not be optimal for our business or for producing results. Similarly, if I'm getting not enough views on a very important page for our website or for our product that's more low funnel, I might want to figure out ways I can drive more traffic to those pages. So looking at page value is an essential component to funnel down a little bit more in depth from just general visitors coming to the site. And this is a little bit hard to read, but you can see the heat map, essentially, and that's the critical element to this. And within this is essentially, you have hours, 0 to 24, all the hours throughout the day, going down the rows. Across, you have the days of the week. And this is essentially, by page, when are visitors coming to your website, and when are they consuming content. And it's critical for you to know when certain customers are coming in the door, or when certain prospects are coming in the door. So you can better serve them content, you can better produce social media around that time, you can better push out content that's going to bring them to your site. And what I think you'd be very surprised at if you looked at this by content, by individual asset, you'd see something that wasn't necessarily even across the board. You'll see some assets produce greater traction at different times. And when you really look into this, and say if you take it to the next step, and you look at it with actual conversion rates. This is an example of for visibility purposes, I only took the first 4 hours of the day. But this shows actual conversion rates on the website from Monday through Saturday. And what you can see is people consume a lot of content at 1 o'clock, apparently, at the end of the weekend, on Sunday. And that might seem counterintuitive, but by doing this by asset, we took a look at what the actual asset was and where this traffic was coming from, and we realized, well, these are folks from Australia, and this is the next day. So that's an important component, and simultaneously, These are small business entrepreneurs for the most part. And so as well, you can see that Saturday was quite high. The reason is that they were looking at content. These are very busy folks. And on the weekend is when they were consuming content and reading about their business. And Monday to Friday is when they're holding their 12 to 12 job, essentially. So the next part we're going to look at is name capture. This would still be qualified by the sort of the top of the funnel. And it's essentially that next step. We have visitors, and we want to capture their names at this point. This is a pretty basic model, and really step 1, step 2, and step 3 are going to be very, very foundational to what we're going to create thereafter. And I'm just going to run through some examples of what new names might look like. You might have like a white paper that you're producing. You're trying to capture names off of it. You might produce this through email sponsorships, page search, SEO. Similarly, you might use, and we're going to use these examples a few more times throughout the seminar. You might use a webinar. We generally produce webinars and about 1 every 2 weeks, and we produce them through a little bit different channels than we would our white papers. It's just what we found to be very, very successful. Some of those channels might be like partner networks. We have a huge partner network that we usually distribute content through, and our email database as well that we've built up over time, sort of an opt-in email database to our blog. Last one that we're going to use, and we're going to revisit these 3 throughout the seminar or throughout the session as well. This would be an example of an infographic that we recently put out. And we use infographics generally for like social, getting a lot of traffic, getting a lot of name capture. We produce these on our blog, and we try to use this very, very top of the funnel piece of content. So when we look at like new names, what we're really looking at here is aggregating data for infographic, white paper, webinar, whatever content categories you might have. These are just representative pieces, but ultimately you're going to want to aggregate this data, and you want to look at a couple things. One is members. Members would just be the total number of people that hit the download button, signed up for something. The net new names is the second component of it. And net new names is something you want to track throughout any campaign that you're going to do, because essentially, and it might be counterintuitive what happens once in a while, which is you put out a piece of content, and you find out that a very high percentage of net new names come from it, even though you thought it was a low funnel piece of content. Similarly, you might put out something very high funnel, but oftentimes you don't see the net new names come from it. So if you're using the same distribution channels, you want to take a look at what the net new names are across the board and be able to analyze that and use that as sort of a foundational platform for the rest of the metrics that we're going to go through. So step 2, or the second section here. Sounds kind of funky, mofu, but we're going to go through these 3 stages. MQLs is really where, and this I see this very much as like the heart of marketing, really. MQLs and opportunities. This is where we're really dealing with a lot of data, and this is really where we have a lot of accountability on the marketing side. So oftentimes what happens, this is a dog trying to lick peanut butter out of a jar. If you can't see it, he's got it on his head and cannot get it off. So what we want to avoid doing is sort of like scraping the barrel clean when it comes to leads, right? Like we get that name capture, and sometimes we want to assign everything because it looks good to say we produced X amount of leads, but really we want to be very, very cautious, even overly cautious, but we want to work with sales to really define what sort of leads we want from those net new names that we're developing. So to do that, first we're going to establish something called MQL qualification, right? And this in itself isn't really going to mean that much, but ultimately it's going to be a benchmark number that we'll be able to adjust over time, right? If we know the qualification rate, we'll be able to come back to this over time and sort of tweak it within the model. So let's take a look at those 3 assets again. We have the white paper, the infographic, and the webinar. I've added program cost in here as well. And here's the, in that 3rd row is, or that 3rd column is new names, which we left off on from the last time. And what we want to add to it is qualified leads. And essentially what those qualified leads are going to be based off of a certain criteria that you have in your organization. We'll touch on this, on what that should look like in this next slide. But ultimately that's going to be very, very different based off the organization. And that should really be a conversation with sales as far as what lead, what new name you are converting into an actual lead and assigning over to that team. But once that is steady, you want to know what the percentage is of conversion. And finally, you'll have some basic cost per lead data as well that we always include within any campaign that we're running. And then this is really where the heart of the matter is. How many people have gotten this in the past, which is the leads are weak? Anybody heard this before? Yeah, I'm sure we all have, right? There's complaints about the lead quality. And so this next step in really defining the quality of the leads is something you can continuously come back to with your sales team. And this is ultimately the one thing that has connected myself with our sales department more heavily than any other. This is going to be a little bit difficult to read, so I'll kind of walk through it. On the left-hand side, you're going to see that there's A, B, C, D. Those are the 4 rows. You have A leads, you have B leads, C leads, D leads. What that essentially is a combination of demographics and behavioral scoring, so explicit and implicit information that we've combined into an A, a B, a C, and a D. We make it as simple as possible for our sales reps to know who to call. We don't give them a score. I've used score on its own before, and the things can get from 0 to 500. Nobody really knows what to make out of it. So we combine these into very, very easy to use letters. And then simultaneously, we look at the columns there, and we have website, paid search, social, iOS, sponsored email. You could really have any channel that you're distributing your content through would essentially fit in these columns. And then this is all content campaigns. We're not including anything else. We're just looking, we're creating this, filtering this, I should say, by actual content campaigns. And within it, you're going to have total number of leads. You're going to have the conversion rate. And you're going to have the total count of everyone involved in that campaign. And what you'll eventually see out of this, by creating this matrix, you can actually pinpoint the top conversion rates and pull them out and say if there's a complaint about lead quality, you can just look at the data and you could say all A's and B's are converting above a 10% ratio, which might be an agreed upon metric. But if you look at the C leads, you've got website producing at 14%, and all others are producing at 5% conversion rate. So we don't want to assign these anymore. Similarly, the Ds are just a complete waste of time. They're converting at about 1%. So you can actually pinpoint within this the exact leads that you're going to want to distribute to your team. From there, we start getting more into the pipeline and monetary values, and we start looking at the opportunity analysis. And what we have here is, again, if we start with those 3 assets, we can look at how many opportunities were actually created from them, the lead to opportunity ratio. And this is really sort of that same qualification metric as before, but one step further in terms of how many leads are becoming qualified opportunities. The pipeline generated, the total pipeline generated. The ASP, which is the average selling price. Won deals, and then ultimately the win rate. And the one I would really focus on within this diagram here is right in the center, which is the pipeline and ASP. The reason for this is we all have sweet spots within the organization. If we want to know where we're producing the top quality content, it's really in these 2 metrics. Reason being is higher isn't always better. Just because a campaign might have the most pipeline generated, you want to know what the ASP is to balance that out. A second reason is we all have sort of a sweet spot. At Handshake, it might be 30K in ACV is our sort of sweet spot deal. It might be different in other organizations. But if my ASP is 90K and my median for the campaigns that I just ran is also 90K, meaning most of those deals that came through are extremely large, well, there's not much predictability around that. It might be fantastic, it might end up being fantastic, but it's not necessarily a predictable model that I've created yet. So ultimately, you want to look at the ASP, and you want to take a look at the content that you're creating and try to project out what ASP is going to be created based off of that, because you can start looking at sales cycles, and you can start understanding better how quickly those deals are going to close. So now we're going to move on to BOFU, which is the bottom of the funnel. Now, bottom of the funnel can get a little bit complex, particularly as we're attributing revenue. It's really simple to look at that first slide from the beginning and look at the top and see a piece of content and then look at a nice little diagram of a funnel and then money coming out and yeah, it's pretty easy. Just put some conversion rates in there and it all works out okay. But the reality is a lot of us are working with large accounts who might be in our pipeline for years, who are consuming a diverse set of content, and it becomes very, very difficult to attribute revenue in such a linear model. It really depends on the sales cycle and the organization, but it can get quite complex. So there's a couple different metrics, or a couple different ways we can look at the data and toggle the data to get a better viewpoint. Maybe not a perfect viewpoint, but at least a better one that's at maximum, sort of the maximum that we have at our capacity. Some of those are first touch, last touch, evenly weighted, a decay attribution model, and something called 40-20-40, which is what I personally advocate quite a bit. So first touch, pretty basic, right? What the first touch of the original lead of a specific account was. And that would be attributing 100% of revenue to it. So if you met somebody at an event a year ago and they ended up closing, you attribute all the revenue that closed to that original event. And the negative of this is if you actually want to justify event budget, will that necessarily be a model that produces the ROI that you're hoping for? So if you produce 100% ROI, or attach 100% ROI to that campaign, is that really going to hold to fruition, and can you replicate that? That's where that model kind of breaks down. And again, it somewhat depends on your sales cycle. Similarly with last touch. Now, I actually prefer first touch more than last touch. I think last touch gets a lot of attention, probably more than any other, simply because it's the most memorable, it's the most recent. And there's validity to it in the sense that the sales rep ultimately constructed a conversation based off of that last touch and progressed it from there. So there is a lot of value to it, but I wouldn't call it 100%. So these are the two I see most often used, is this first touch, last touch, but we know that it's not necessarily ideal to be using either one. So some of these other models were developed to sort of tackle that problem. And I'll go into some of the pros and cons of each of these. First one is evenly weighted. I don't particularly use evenly weighted, but nonetheless, if you wanted to say everything that a prospect ever touched or an account ever touched should be evenly attributed to all the marketing campaigns behind it, that would be this model. The negative of it is if you had a large account who was consuming a lot of data over time, and you had a very specific last touch and a very specific first touch, and then you had multiple members of the account consuming data over the course of a year or 2 years, you'd end up attributing all that revenue evenly. And that might not be the most logical way to do it. So it's not something that I've used, but nonetheless, if you wanted to look at it for comparative purposes, it's something that I have seen used. Another one is, I think I skipped one there. 40-20-40. And this is personally my favorite way of attributing revenue. And the reason is it balances out the first and last touch. So you're attributing most revenue to the most significant events, right? The most significant events, if you just thought of the most critical components of the lead life cycle, it would be that first touch, getting somebody in the door, which is and then converting them, that last touch. So this attributes it evenly across the board, and 40% the first and last. And then in the middle, everything else is given 20%. Again, it's far from perfect, but I think it's better than a lot of the other models. And then there's this last one from BrightFunnel here. And this is a platform I've used in the past. They're able to sort of look at each one of these in comparison with one another. I think they're actually exhibiting here. It's a product I've used more historically. And essentially, you could put these next to each other and compare how revenue attribution would be across the board, across each model, across first touch. Here's how the attribution would be across last touch. Here's how the attribution would be across 40-20-40, across evenly weighted, and across decay model. And decay model, I'm not sure if there's a slide for it there, but decay model would just be something around older assets are attributed less over time, right? So the newest stuff gets the most. The last stuff, the furthest away stuff, gets the least attribution to it, and you just scale it up from there. This is step 7. I think we just skipped one there. I don't think I pressed it. Yeah, there it is. This is influenced by content campaign. So once you somewhat start attributing revenue based off those different models, you want to know how you can actually track the influence of all the campaigns you're running. Meaning, there might be, think of those different models we were using. You had the 40-20-40, which would be a good example for this. And in that middle, that 20, what if you have the same assets that are repeating themselves and other ones that are not? You would want to know across the entire board, which campaigns are influencing, which pieces of content are influencing deals across the board. And what this can help you do, and why this might not be so distinct in those first touch, last touch models, is you might have a great nurture program, and maybe on the third step of your trial process, everyone's getting this certain piece of content, and it's really helping in terms of actually converting deals later on in the sales cycle. And you want to know that. So influence is essentially what is influencing deals based off any touch. Anytime a piece of content is touching a prospect, it's going to be logged here, and you'll be able to look at that over time. And you want to be able to track that by both number of opportunities and both along with the total pipeline. The second half of this step 7, is the influence by the content campaign. So essentially, once you have like all those campaigns in a line, you'd want to be able to aggregate that data, right? So you'd want to look at all those campaigns, which ones are influencing your revenue, and which ones, what actual content categories are creating the most results based off of what stage of the funnel. So for example, here we have a couple of examples of white paper and webinar, and we break those down by high funnel and low funnel. When we're creating assets, usually we're creating them based off high funnel, low funnel, or some other stage in the sales cycle. And so once we do that, we can somewhat start to see which content assets by group are producing the greatest ROI for us. Similarly, which content assets by group are accelerating sales cycle the most. Because if we can increase sales cycle predictably, it's a way of justifying revenue and a way of closing deals faster. So sales cycle is something you don't traditionally see as much. At least I haven't in a lot of traditional marketing tracking. But ultimately, you'll be very surprised if you start tracking your content campaigns on how the different ones significantly impact the sales cycle. So those are the 7 steps. I guess at this point, depending on where you are, and I'm sure we have a lot of different starting points from those in the audience. If you don't have much reporting set up, I would say some of the next steps taking away from this session would be to identify the KPIs that you are tracking and which ones you think you should be adding in to your model. Because essentially, this is about creating a model, a predictable model to close deals. Second would be tracking this on a weekly basis. Essentially, it's as simple as we're creating a weekly tracking sheet, and we're adding these numbers in on a weekly basis. And third, you would start simple and then expand from there. When you talk about expanding, there's a lot of different cohorts. We work in 15 different industries, so there's a lot of different cohorts, a lot of different groupings that we're looking at this data in. But first, create the model. Create that linear model that you can actually base some conversion rates off of. And then work from there in terms of creating a more complex model across different industries. And if you are using something pretty sophisticated at this point, just run a quick audit as far as what your reporting cycle looks like, what numbers you're using, and if you really feel like you have that predictability. An easy way to do it is to take a look, who's going to say no to if I put $1 in and I get $10 out as far as budget justification goes. So look at the campaigns you're running, and if you're having difficulty getting the budget allocation that you might want for your content campaigns, take a look if that model is really clearly articulated. And then the third will be just to dive deeper into the data, make those cohorts known, and start breaking out the data in more subcategories from there. This is some resources I used to put together the presentation today. There are some good examples here of dashboards that you can use for downloading Google Analytics dashboards and such. There's some easy out-of-the-box things from Kissmetrics and Salesforce dashboards for lead tracking. You can actually just integrate them directly with your instance. Similarly, I mentioned BrightFunnel throughout this presentation as a reporting tool that I've used very successfully in the past. And fourth, on that grading area, we were mentioning those A, B, C, D grades before. I've used a tool. We've created that out of the box, or we created that on our own first, and then we used an out-of-the-box solution with something called Infer to make that a more predictable system, I would say. And that's about it. If you have any questions, feel free to let me know. We have 10 seconds left, so if you have any quick questions, you can let me know right now. Yes. Yep.
Have most of the marketable database for your industry, and really what I guess identifies them as an opportunity is them changing to an opportunity. So would you recommend using a different metric if we have
Yeah, I see what you're saying. So you have most of the members in your industry. I think it would be looking at what is a member versus what is qualified as a net new name. And net new name could even be something that's recycled. So for example, if we're running a brand new campaign based off a very different product, even if we have that name in our database, if we're selling a mobile solution and then we're selling the direct solution, if this lead goes hibernated for a certain period of time, 60 days or so, and then they fill out information for this over here, we'd consider them a net new name, simply because it's a brand new product that they're interested in, and it's more based off of the interest rather than just the volume of names. Anything else I can answer? We have no minutes. Okay, thank you very much.